Welcome to Counter Narrative News, giving you news analysis and exploring current affairs on a daily basis. This is the first of a series of what should be daily interventions for Counter Narrative News, and it's a longer recording as obviously we're looking through the past year. So let's get straight into it. In January in 2022, an extraordinary development occurred in the Central Asian state of Kazakhstan. It's a major gas and oil producing state, and the conditions of the workers in these industries is increasingly, as it is everywhere, under pressure around rising food and energy prices, and also being squeezed in the workplace around workplace conditions and workplace terms and wages. So there's a strong trade union movement in Kazakhstan. Things came to a boil. National strikes were occurring and protests, which led to a nationwide movement that was challenging the status quo of the Kazakh government. What then followed was Russia enacted its CSTO, multilateral military and political body, which saw the Russian army intervene and crush the move of the Kazakh workers for better terms and conditions, and also ultimately a fundamental reorder of their society and economy in their favor. The uprising was crushed, and it was supported by China. China itself has hundreds of billions of dollars of investments throughout Central Asia, including Kazakhstan. And because of this and other deeper cultural and longer standing issues, the Chinese government has very little support and a lot of hostility throughout Central Asia and Kazakhstan. And obviously the Russian army intervening in Kazakhstan increased the resentment of a lot of Kazakh people towards its neighbor, its big brother neighbor, one should say, towards the north. Following closely on that was the Russian start of its Ukraine war, and perhaps the Russian leadership having somewhat been quote-unquote dizzy with success over the last near decade or longer, you could argue. The first in Chechen war conducted by Moscow, its operation to reclaim Crimea from Ukraine, and then its annexation of parts of East Ukraine in their so-called People's Republics post-2014, and then the Russian military intervention in Syria, which perhaps emboldened the Russian leadership then to enact their war in Ukraine, conducting a series of military campaigns and occupations, and then annexation. This is probably one of the greatest political crises that Europe has faced in a long time, and it's a global crisis encompassing all states of the world, actually, due to the Ukraine's positioning in the world economy and its relationship to many other states and regions, not least Turkey and the Middle East to the south, and the Europe and European Union towards the west, and obviously Russia and China as well, with Russia being the main actor in that. Then also we had the uprising in Sri Lanka, which again was a result of the crisis around energy prices and food prices, but also just shortages and petrol running very low. This saw an uprising of the Sri Lankan people across religious and ethnic lines from March to November, which saw the protesters storm the government buildings and the homes of the political class of Sri Lanka and deposed the ruling political class for that moment. Again, China has long-standing relations with the Sri Lankan state going back many decades, and due to this, and also China not really coming to any real assistance of Sri Lanka in this moment of crisis, the Sri Lankan people have a great and general hostility towards China. And Sri Lanka more recently has had to turn to the IMF for a bailout loan. So on the one hand, Sri Lanka has major economic partners with China, with India, and the West, but it's chosen to, or perhaps it has no choice, to go to the IMF to try to address its economic crisis. In Latin America, you have several things in movement, not least the elections in Brazil, which saw Lula return to the presidency of the Workers' Party. He was in government in the early 2000s and he oversaw economic reforms which lifted some 40 million Brazilians out of abject poverty and massively increased the Brazilian working class. After that, you have Bolsonaro, a hard-right populist politician aligned to the global right-wing trends that we are seeing. And that was pushed back by the movement headed by Lula, and he won the elections. And most recently, Bolsonaro has decided to go to the USA, Miami, if I'm not mistaken. At the same time, in Latin America, you have the former president deposed, who was aligned to left-wing politics, and that has triggered mass protests across Peru, but particularly the really kind of poor areas of the Quechua-speaking people. More recently, we've had a lot of internal interesting things happen in China. China was imposing its quote-unquote zero COVID policy over the last few years with the pandemic. And what's happened is things came to a head in recent months. For example, the big Foxconn factory, which basically supplies the global market with iPhones. There was a COVID outbreak in the Foxconn factory, and the Chinese workers there were obliged by the Chinese authority to live and sleep within their factory grounds despite the COVID outbreak. This resulted in many factory workers at Foxconn literally jumping over the perimeter fence to escape. And also many other protests were sparked across different social classes and regions in China. In a sense, the Chinese people obviously felt that this zero COVID policy of very stringent lockdowns, of containing residents through QR codes access or denial of access was too much to tolerate, and people came out in the streets against China, and China reversed its policy in a 180-degree turn and got rid of the zero COVID policy, and now is managing things with COVID outbreaks going forward. The protests also challenged the Chinese leadership and the head of the Chinese state, Xi Jinping's attempts at showing himself and his state to be stable and to really kind of preemptively stop any kind of mass protests against the Chinese political system. And with the COVID protests, it kind of totally contributed to destroying that attempt of social stability going forward and for the Chinese leadership. And it really challenged the Chinese leadership's projection globally that they have the most successful policies around COVID. Of course, it has to be said that the COVID deaths in China is absolutely negligible compared to the mass social deaths around the handling of the pandemic in countries like Britain, Brazil, the USA, and India. Again, more recently, we've had the World Cup hosted by Qatar. Qatar, like a lot of the Gulf monarchies, are historical creations of initially the British colonialists, and they've subsequently had very close relations with the USA and Britain. Qatar itself holds the biggest military base for the USA on its soil and is closely integrated, although not a member of, but it's closely integrated in the NATO military alliance. Qatar has also contributed massively to the recent conflicts in Libya with the NATO intervention there in 2011, and also the Syrian civil war from 2011 onwards as well. The Qataris have backed rebel forces or armed groups or armed opposition in alliance with the interests of its Western senior partners. So Qatar holds the World Cup, and then there's this kind of this contradiction on the one hand of Qatar being a close Western ally, but at the same time some Western media kind of identifying what they consider as problems of the way the Qatari government handles things like migrant labor, and also its social policies around the gay community. And lots of people were contending that a lot of this from Western media was in a framework of prejudices against Muslims and the Islamic community. So you have this kind of defense of Qatar on the one hand, but on the other hand, Qatar is a very close ally to the British government and monarchy and the USA, so it has good relations with the West, and it seeks, like similar to the other Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, to reform its image in a West-facing manner to attempt to show itself as a modern and even kind of posturing as some kind of state and government with progressive social and cultural policies. The Qatari World Cup actually was interesting because the carbon emissions, the polluting of the environment of the Qatari World Cup as compared to the previous World Cup hosted by Moscow saw the Qatari World Cup have 5 times more emissions than the World Cup before it. And as I mentioned before, there was controversies as well around the treatment of migrant labor in the construction, literally, of the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of the World Cup, which was debated. Now to some more domestic review in terms of what's happened in Britain. It's been a long year globally, and it's been a long year domestically in terms of what's happened in Britain. So we've had the big political crises ongoing in the Tory leadership and the government. Boris leaving the leadership of the Tory party and the position of Prime Minister. Then came in the 40 something days of the Truss Kwarteng government, which tried to implement some very right-wing fiscal policies, which blew up back in their face, and that whole government crumbled with hardly after a month, somewhat infamously, and a slight comedic element to that. A lettuce was put up on a live stream next to a portrait of Liz Truss, and the question put to viewers at the beginning of the Liz Truss government was, is the lettuce going to outlive Liz Truss? And it did. Then what follows is the Rishi Sunak government, the first person of colour to be Prime Minister in Britain of Indian heritage. But what's consistent throughout these different Tory administrations, as we've seen, is a continuation and an attempt of deepening the hard right trajectory of this government in its fiscal and economic policies in the context of the quote-unquote energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, etc., and also its kind of trajectory towards even further right in the quote-unquote culture wars as manifest in the policies around migration. So the Tory weaponization of migration through the English Channel with the quote-unquote small boats, which they want to present as a major national crisis to the people, identifying and targeting the Albanian community particularly, as the Tories present them as a disproportionate problem, which then triggered a mass protest in Parliament Square in London a few months ago by the Albanian community, pushing back on the framing of their community as somehow naturalized criminal elements who are trying to infiltrate this government. And also the hard right Tory policy of the Rwanda expulsion policy of attempting to remove asylum seekers here without going through the official and legally binding asylum process in actually just negating that and wiping that out and trying to remove people to the Central African country of Rwanda. The Tories have not been so far successful in that, although the High Court has ruled that that policy is not illegal, it's legal, but there'll be appeals at that at the High Court. So that issue continues to go on. In the same context, we have the trade union strikes, or the strike wave as it's called, that started in the late summer, but which then kind of faltered and has lost a lot of its momentum due to the cancellation of a lot of strike dates by the railway union of the RMT and also the posties union of the CWU. But the nurses have also been balloted and they've gone on a one-day strike. So the trade union strikes as a response by the poorer members of trade unions who are under pressure with rising bills, rising food costs, and deteriorating conditions and income from work. All of this has kind of continues to push towards strike action. A lot of the strikes have accepted a negotiated settlement of 4 to 8% of a so-called quote-unquote pay rise, but in the context of some 12% inflation of recent years, that's a real terms pay cut. So it informs the trade union strike movement going forward in a very problematic way. But people will continue to suffer increasingly under these different societal crises as we go forward. So probably it will result in further social disturbances and conflicts and fissures. Also, we had at a very similar time was the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest ruling British monarch that there ever was, who's handed over to King Charles. At the same moment, we had the trade union strikes going on, which were cancelled by the RMT leadership in deference to the monarchy and the death of the Queen and the handover to King Charles. We also saw the Metropolitan Police kill a young black man called Chris Carber in Streatham in South London, which triggered black radical protests in central London at the very same time that the monarchy was doing a handover. So it was a very kind of precarious political and social cultural moment for the British government and monarchy. The Chris Carber police killing did not lead to any disturbances or any particular wave of protests. So the potential of the killing of Chris Carber to trigger protest, to really change the image of a stable monarchy handover in Britain, I mean, challenging that did not happen. The handover happened from to King Charles in a relatively smooth way, and also indicates a growing right-wing trajectory in this country, because it's very unusual and it was never heard before that people are saying long live the king or long live the monarch in TV news interviews, which we are hearing all the time. Also, going back to the Rwanda policy and the policies around migration and asylum seekers and refugees by the Tories, these are right-wing policies, some of which, like the Rwanda policy, that the most far right of organisations and movement in Britain, like the National Front and the British National Party, have never actually advocated even policies so much to the right. Also in September, we had an interesting situation in Leicester. Leicester has been now for some years the first city and major urban area in Britain that has a majority population of residents who are not white. So African heritage and Asian heritage communities, particularly Asian heritage communities, constitute the largest ethnic population in Leicester. And one would have thought that this perhaps would have galvanized in a positive way these communities, together with their counterparts in the white different communities as well. But actually what's happened in Leicester, we saw young working class people, respectively from the Muslim and the Hindu community, have tensions and have clashes with each other, behind which these young people, there are sectarian religious forces in both communities, in the Muslim and in the Hindu community, who are vested in developing this conflict, particularly the Hindu right, which is called Hindutva, very closely associated to the right-wing populist, Hindu right-wing populist government of Modi and his BJP party, are involved in these lesser disturbances and have close relations with the Conservative Party in particular, but also the opposition Labour Party as well. And then finishing off, it's been the first Christmas holidays and winter period since the beginning of the pandemic where there's been no restrictions around the COVID pandemic. So people are mixing freely, and with that, in society, a lot of infections are mixing, and there is a disproportionate spike. I mean, it's pretty much everyone who knows people in Britain, everyone they know, or the children they know, are sick with some kind of cold or flu symptoms, and tragically, a couple of dozen children have died from strep A. So this is also contributing to societal and social pressure amongst communities as well. So as we go forward into 2023, there's obviously going to be more things that are going to come out of the global economic crisis around energy prices, bills, the cost of living crisis, the ongoing culture war with a kind of ascendant hard right populist movement across the world, which is seeing a little bit of pushback here and there, but it's generally having victories going forward. So anyway, I hope that was interesting to our listeners, and please feel free to ask any questions for myself to comment on going forward. Please subscribe to this channel, like this video, please share across your networks, and feel free to comment. Thank you. All the best.